Hey guys, it's Chris. From their tactics and training to their inventions for battle, join me as I reveal 9 things you probably didn't know about the Roman military. Number 9. Beginning of battlefield medicine. The ancient world had many interesting beliefs and customs, some good and some not so good. But when it came to medicine, a lot of the things they believed weren't what we would call rational today, to the extent that the ancient Romans, Greeks, Persians, and more had rather grotesque medical practices that often did more harm than good. However, the Roman military was the exception to this rule, as they did some things pretty well. And what better place to practice and learn about medicine than a battlefield 2,000 years ago? And one thing they were really good at was bandages. It may seem rudimentary that bandages are needed in militaries, but back then, things like this were just being discovered. Roman medics realized that by using bandages and tying them up with certain things, it could help treat the wounds. There's a book written by Jack McCallum called Military Medicine from Ancient Times to the 21st Century, which revealed that not only did the medics in the Roman military use bandages, but they used things like honey, vinegar, and even cobwebs in order to seal them and disinfect, thus protecting the soldiers from further wounds and infections. But now why does this matter? If you fast forward to the modern day, you'll see that one of the highest things in demand is spider silk. And why is that? Well, because it has one of the highest tensile strengths in the world, which can make bandages and various other materials much stronger. So while we're trying to make use of this now, the Romans were doing it long before the age of modern medicine. And that proves that while much ancient medicine could be backwards, it was also kind of ahead of the curve. It should also be noted that any and all doctors that were in the military were considered as part of the military, even taking the oath that the soldiers did before going to work. Number 8. One of the deadliest defeats in history. The Second Punic War was a conflict that the Roman Republic may have won, but it came at a huge cost. This war was one that featured the legendary Hannibal Barca, who came to try and burn Rome to the ground in the name of his father. One of his greatest accomplishments was the victory at the Battle of Cannae, a battle that's taught in military schools all over because of the strategy that was used, and causing a massacre for the Romans in the process. The cause of this massacre was due in part to Gaius Terentius Varro. He was one of 2 men who were to lead the massive Roman army, said to be close to 90,000 men, to defeat Hannibal. The other general, Lucius Aemilius Palus, was a very cautious man and respected Barca's army. Varro, however, was impatient and rage-filled. He wanted Barca dead by his own hand. And Barca knew this, and he hatched a scheme. Back in those days, the Romans had their generals rotate control of the army every other day to keep them sharp. So when Barca knew that Varro was in charge, he got the general to attack him. Once the battle started, Barca allowed the Romans to slam into the middle of his forces, and then slowly backed up. Eventually, Barca's armies formed a crescent moon, one that encompassed the entire Roman army. And then, with them surrounded, he closed the ranks and wiped out a vast majority of them. It's said that at most, only about 15,000 Romans escaped the battle with their lives. So all told, at least 70,000 Romans lost their lives in this one battle, making it one of the deadliest single battles in the history of the world. Granted, Rome would eventually win the war, but this battle made them change their tactics, and it took them 14 years to drive Hannibal away. It's also noted that some of the tactics they used, including appointing new leadership, was the first of many steps that led to the rise of Julius Caesar. Number 7. They were bred to adapt. Regardless of the time period, what makes a successful army is the ability to adapt on the fly and ensure that should something go wrong, you'll be able to keep a level head and move on. Or should a defeat happen, that you'll be able to take steps to make sure that it doesn't happen again. In the course of history, the Roman army is said to have been the best adapting army ever, or at least one of the most adapting. For example, the idea of keeping to certain traditions in the army never held sway with the Romans. Sure, they kept track when something worked, especially with their training, but they were never so rigid that they believed that they had to use these techniques all the time. They were consistently pushed to learn new techniques, test new weapons, formations, and whatever else might give them the edge in battle. Especially since they were taking over the world and facing all kinds of people, weather, and terrain. They were so good at what they did that historians note they could fight on basically any terrain and in any climate, which back then would have been especially hard to do given the non-modern technologies and medicine. Now, the Roman military did have plenty of defeats over the years, don't get us wrong, but history notes that they did bounce back from a vast majority of them, which is why they reigned for such a long time, regardless of whether they were a republic or an empire. And now for number 6, but first make sure you're subscribed to World List. And can you guess how many soldiers the Roman army had at its peak? Let me know your guess in the comments below. Number 6. How to deal with mutiny. In the military, one of the worst things that can happen to its leaders via generals, commanders, or other overseers is the act of mutiny. Mutiny is when the soldiers or ranks decide to take charge for themselves because they have no faith in their current leadership. This can lead to bloodshed, death, and a total loss for the entire cause. Not to mention complete chaos. So the Roman military had certain methods to ensure that mutiny didn't happen, or that it didn't happen very often at least. The most feared method was that of decimation. If a large group of men tried to commit mutiny, they would take that group, and every 10th man in the group would either be beaten or stoned to death. This was considered justice of a higher order because instead of just going for the ringleaders, they punished the group as a whole so no one was innocent. Decimation soon became a major threat to the ranks, even being used by leaders like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus during their reigns as emperor and commanders, though eventually the practice was abolished within the empire. Number 5. A defeat changed their beliefs on training. While it's true that in the greater tapestry of history the Roman military is one of the most feared units ever, in the very beginning of the army they were nothing more than farmers and other men who owned property in Rome. It was believed that they could be trusted to fight for Rome as they had the most to lose. In 390 BC, though, a war with the Gauls left them utterly broken. Their armies were destroyed and the city of Rome was ransacked for months. It was only after this defeat that they realized that they needed to not just be stronger, but they also needed a military that was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. And so they got to work immediately. Which brings us to number 4. The training. Over the course of centuries, Rome worked hard to redefine their tactics and their skills on the battlefield. After their defeat by the Gauls, they refused to lose again on the point of not having a good military that was well trained. When the rebuilding of their army began, they focused on physical training as much as anything else. The new recruits for their army were drilled constantly on various things. They were to run miles upon miles every day to help build up their endurance so they could march great distances in heavy armor. One such test was going 19 miles and being told they had to do it in 5 hours, all the while carrying a full pack of weapons and other supplies. They were also trained in multiple weapons, including swords, spears, and the massive shields that they carried around. Finally, they were trained in the mind as well, taught to understand and predict tactics and formations of both their own armies and their enemies. No army in history was said to have gone through more training than the Roman military. Number 3. An army of volunteers. The way you build up an army says a lot about not just the nation that controls them, but the people who become part of it. In the earliest days of Rome, the army was only comprised of those who had property in Rome, as they were the upper class. But then to help bolster their ranks even more, the Romans would conscript some of their lower-class citizens into becoming infantry for them. Eventually, though, this was seen as flawed, so both the property requirement and the conscription elements were done away with completely. Between 30 BC and 284 AD, the entire Roman army, save for some mercenaries they would occasionally call in to help, was made up entirely of volunteers. Considering that at times the Roman army could be tens of thousands of men strong, that's a really impressive number of volunteers. But it wasn't just loyalty that brought these volunteers to the army. Rather, it was the possibility of not just making money, but also earning a place in Rome beyond where they were when they entered the military. To that end, many volunteers signed up for decades of service to Rome, and many of them prospered because of this. Number 2. Tunneling. In the ancient days of war, one of the most common kinds of battle was known as siege. Basically, an army would surround a city or fortress with heavy defenses, and a battle both outward and inward would commence to see who could last longer. The Romans, in both phases of their reign, were legendary for their siege warfare tactics, and one tactic that they loved very much early on was tunneling. They would literally use the time that sieges had, often months and sometimes years, and make a tunnel that would allow them to dig under the enemy's walls and go right into the city or fortress itself. Plus, with the large number of men they had, they could make progress very easily just by swapping men out. The Romans did this for many sieges until word got out that they were using this tactic, so their enemies put up defenses to prevent it. Number 1. Seasonal warfare. But before we get to this, remember how I asked you how many soldiers are believed to have been in the Roman army at its peak? Well, the answer, if you've guessed, is 500,000 soldiers with 33 legions, that's 182,000 legionnaires, and more than 400 auxiliary units. That's around 250,000 auxiliaries, and 75,000 served as cavalry. Knowing that the Romans were one of the most successful militaries in history, you might think that they were fighting all year round. But that isn't the case. In fact, the Romans were well known for their seasonal wars and exploits. Once they became a massive fighting force, they knew that fighting in the winter was dangerous and would weigh heavily on the soldiers. So they decided that the wars they fought would only be done in the harvest season, which is basically the summer, with only a few exceptions, such as a siege or key battles. It's said that during the long winters, soldiers would spend time hunting to keep themselves fresh and read for battles that would return. Thanks for watching. So what'd you think of these facts about the Roman military? What was the most interesting thing to you? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to World List, and I'll see you next time.